in the very early days, way back in the 1980s, I was appointed to the House of Lords in 83, can't believe it, 40 years ago. Anyway, in the early decade, I did a lot of work for Poland, because Poland was in the very dark days of martial law in those days, and I did a lot of work, the very good organisation, Medical Aid for Poland Fund. And we took medical aid in. I went many times on the trucks, speaking for the Polish people who were suffering at the hands of communism. And that emerged, praise God, into freedom in '89. And then I did a lot of work in Russia with Soviet orphans who were having a horrific time, and helped to establish programs for enabling children to be kept in care homes or homes for orphaned children. And then I decided that I wanted to diversify. So I founded HART. It stands for Humanitarian Aid Relief Trust. And HART is established to try to provide aid and advocacy for people suffering persecution and oppression in areas not reached by other major aid organizations, either for political reasons or security reasons. Because the big organizations like the UN, I have great respect for them, but they can only go with permission of a sovereign government. If a sovereign government is victimizing a minority in its own borders, doesn't allow them, then they can't go. So we do spend quite a lot of our time going a bit unofficially. We work with local partners, and they're the heroes and heroines. But on the security side, most of them are in war zones or conflict zones of some kind. And it's quite dangerous getting there. And other aid organizations, quite rationally, maybe a little bit nervous about that, and I can understand that for their staff and their whole raison d'etre. But we do go where it may be politically incorrect and where it may be dangerous. And so a lot of our partners are in conflict zones in areas where they're not supported by their national governments. And we do provide aid and advocacy, and many of them are actually suffering violations of human rights.
Do you have one sort of particular success you'd like to share with me from these years of doing this work?
That's a good question. Well, yes, I mean, I think we do. One or two of the areas where we work in HART, we now no longer need to work there, because when we first started there, the population, the civilians, suffered from the criteria which HART tries to address. And one of those, was way back, was in northern Uganda. And we went there in the dark days when the Lord's Resistance Army was active and was attacking civilians, and it was hell on earth, I can tell you. And the first time I went there, I went with a good colleague, and it was really dangerous getting there, and dangerous when we were there. But we asked the local people, what's your priority? We always ask people their priority. We don't tell them what we're going to do, we ask them, because they know their priorities. And they said, please, help for orphans. There are so many orphans because the parents have been killed and have had to flee and so on. And those little skeletons is all that they were. To cut a long story short, we managed to provide food aid and other aid for those orphans. And we also helped find them parental care and so on, to care for those orphans in a holistic way. And if you go there now, I can't believe it, but just one little vignette. Those kids are now teenagers. And there was recently a tournament in Africa, a football tournament. A lot of African countries took part. And our little team from our Orphan Patongo program took part. And they won the tournament. And they were so talented that the United States chose one of those football players, kids, to go to the States here to develop a proper professional football program, and Britain selected another. So from being little orphans who were like little skeletons to being such competent football players in their teens that they were actually selected to represent their countries or to attend other countries for training is, I think, an example. And we no longer need that orphan program now. It has been successful. All the orphans have been happily placed with families, and that was a very happy outcome to a very tragic situation.
We get so caught up in thinking about the many big issues that we have. Sometimes I have some very bad days, but like little small wins for these kids, this is all the difference. And a sports team, apparently. Thank you for sharing that. You know, the other thing, I know you do advocate for places where you can't go very easily to inspect, so to speak. And I know that you were involved in the coalition to investigate the persecution of Falun Gong in China, and you've actually taken your own government to task around the forced organ harvesting issue.
I mentioned aid and advocacy, and they're obviously closely entwined, but there are issues where I think we do need to defend freedom and fundamental values, and that's part of a Christian mandate and part of our mandate. And maybe one of the areas where we border, if you like, between the controversial and the fundamental principle is maybe Nigeria. We do a lot of work in Middle Belt Nigeria, with sort of Jos Plateau State to the north, going down to Abuja, the capital. And the Islamist Fulani, I always make a distinction between Islam and Islamism. Islam is Muslims, moderate Muslims, friends, so on. Islamism are the Islamist, and they are the ones who carry out the brutal attacks. And in middle Nigeria, they are attacking frequently the Christian villages and townships in Middle Belt, and that's gone on for some time, and the attacks are ruthless. I mean, I've been to the villages that have suffered an attack from the Islamist Fulani, the Fulani herdsmen, and the homes are still burning. You've seen the corpses before they're buried, and it is a hell on earth. And I remember one occasion when I was there, and they were just recovering from an attack, and I met a young mother, and she tried to flee with her little 6-year-old daughter. But the village had been surrounded by the Islamist Fulani. They couldn't escape. They were caught. They slashed her across the shoulder with a machete, and then they cut her little daughter's throat. And she fainted with having been tapped by the machete. And when she woke up, her little 6-year-old daughter was lying dead next to her. And inside the little daughter's mouth was her mother's finger. They cut her mother's finger off and stuck it inside her mouth. I mean, heartbreak land. But that there's attacks on Christian villages in Middle Belt Nigeria are still going on. And one of our aid responses, we always ask the local people, and they said there are 1.5 million people displaced from these villages and these little townships, and their children are desperate for education, desperate. So we have what are called Roads to Hope education vans, and we take education supplies to those kids who are displaced. And you could see the joy on their faces, on the kids' faces, when these education vans arrive. And they're not just books, I mean, there are computers and all sorts of things which they need for proper education. Here's hope for the future. And what a privilege to be able to do that. And we're now just diversifying a little into also providing healthcare vans for the displaced people in Middle Belt Nigeria.
Don't forget to subscribe to our Alerts newsletter, and you'll never miss an episode.